Okay, so the book that we're reading is Aristotle's most extensive and most important work on the topic of ethics. Basically, how should we behave? What's the best way to live? What's the difference between good and bad? And this book, like most of Aristotle's writings that we have today, was probably his lecture notes. It probably wasn't intended for publication, but rather was intended to be read, or maybe read by students that weren't able to attend his courses, but it wasn't widely disseminated. You have to note also that at this time, the printing press hadn't yet been invented. So the way that written documents were shared in ancient Greece was on scrolls. So they would be written out by hand, and if they were going to be transferred from one person to another, they would have to be transcribed if the original copy was to be preserved. So it wasn't like the printing press, and it wasn't like email. It was a lot more labor intensive to transfer information. But these texts were originally written on scrolls, and they were written in ancient Greek, and eventually, of course, they've been translated from ancient Greek to English. Many of them were first translated to Latin, and then the Latin was translated either directly to English or back to the Greek that was thought to have been the original Greek, and then to English in order to try to get a more accurate translation. Anyway, that's a lot of detail about how it is we even can read this book from Aristotle, but it might be useful to have in mind as you are reading it. So the book deals with topics such as what's the best way to live, what is friendship, what's pleasure, what's justice, what is choice, and what is happiness. We're going to focus on just some of these questions here, and we're only reading about a 10th or a 20th of the book. The book, Nicomachean Ethics, is, we say, 10 books long because the way we refer to the parts of a text like the Nicomachean Ethics, an ancient Greek text, is in terms of books. I know that's a little bit confusing, but there are 10 books in the Nicomachean Ethics. These books are actually more like chapters because they're only about as long as what we would call chapters today. Part of why they're called books is because they were on separate scrolls, or they were delineated from one another in that way as books. So let's dive into the text. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to work through just the very beginning of the text so that we can get a handle on what is being said here. Okay? So I'm actually going to read this first paragraph from the slides, which is just the very beginning of the text, and I'm going to pause periodically to explain what Aristotle is saying here. So Aristotle starts out, every art and every inquiry, and similarly every action and pursuit, is thought to aim at some good. Okay, so pause here for just a moment. When Aristotle says art, the Greek word for art is techne. That word may look familiar to you. Actually, it's the root of our word technology. So the ancient Greek word for art referred to any kind of practical activity that produces something. It's also the root of our word artifact, which you can think of artifact as a different word that refers to things like technology, often to very simple kinds of technologies like tools or pottery and things like that. Okay. So when Aristotle says every art and every inquiry, he means every inquiry, that is every pursuit of information, but also every activity that human beings engage in that produces something, because that's what that word techne means in ancient Greek. So he does mean things like sculpture, things that we would today call arts, like sculpture and painting, because they produce something. But he also means things like bridge building or building a house. Those would also count as a techne because they're activities that produce something, and that's what that word means. So in this first sentence, Aristotle says every art and every inquiry, so and similarly every action and pursuit, basically everything that we do is thought to aim at something. Okay, so that's interesting. You can ask yourself, is that true? Is it true that everything that we do is for some purpose? That's what he's saying. Okay, and then, so you can keep that question in mind. You can think about it, but I'm just going to move on to get to continue getting a handle on what he's saying here. Then he says, for this reason, the good has rightly been declared to be that at which all things aim. So here he's just citing somebody. He's kind of referring to what some other people say at the time. Okay, he says some people say for that reason that the definition of the good is whatever something aims at. So that in a way, the good, that question of remember that question came up earlier, what do we mean by the word good? That we could just say that the word good means whatever it is that something aims at, or the purpose of something. Okay. And then he goes on to say, but a certain difference is found among ends. Some are activities, others are products apart from the activities that produce them. So the point there is that, we have to ask, what does this word end mean here? It seems like he means by end the same thing as he's earlier called the aim of some activity. Okay, so the end is like the purpose or the goal or the aim of an activity. Okay, the good that the activity is supposed to bring about. And he says some of these ends are activities and some are products apart from the activities. So part of the point there is that sometimes we do an action for the sake of another action, like a larger action that we're taking, that first action was just a part of. Sometimes we're doing an action for the sake of some result that will be brought about by the action. So the basic picture that we have here so far is of activities and of goods or ends produced by activities. And these goods or ends are things that are aimed at in the activities. They're the things that the activities aim at, or that the activities are pursued for the sake of. Okay, and these ends can be of two basic types so far. Okay, they can be themselves activities, or they can be products of the activities. That is, some resulting condition or some resulting thing that is produced by the activities. And now Aristotle goes on to give some examples, and also to make the point that there is a difference between both the activities. There are different kinds of activities, and there are different kinds of things aimed at by those activities. Okay, so he says, as there are many actions, arts, and sciences, their ends also are many. The end of the medical art is health, that of shipbuilding, a vessel, that is a ship, that of strategy, victory, and that of economics, wealth. So here we have a list of different actions, arts, and sciences. They're just examples, okay? This list could go on and on and on, because remember, Aristotle says every action and every inquiry and every art, every techne, okay, is aiming at something, some end. So these are just three examples, but there could be many, many more in the list, okay? But here are his examples. Medicine is intended to produce health. Military science is intended to produce victory. Economic science is intended to produce wealth. So these activities are taken for the sake of something else, their end. And these things that they're for the sake of are listed here in the second column. And now Aristotle goes on to talk about the relation between different activities. Okay, so this is going to add a level of complexity. He says, but where such arts fall under a single capacity, as bridle making and the other arts concerned with the equipment of horses fall under the art of riding, and this in every military action under strategy, in the same way other arts fall under yet others. In all of these, the ends of the master arts are to be preferred to all the subordinate ends, for it's for the sake of the former that the latter are pursued. So basically what he's saying here is that sometimes we do one kind of activity for the sake of something else, either an end or an activity, which would be that'd be like we do A for the sake of B, but we're doing B for the sake of some other thing, C. Okay, so the things that we do for the sake of something else have a kind of nested structure. So bridle making, that is making a bridle for a horse, the thing that you put on a horse to help steer the horse, is part of the general art of horsemanship, okay, or the art of riding, as he calls it here. And that art, that techne of riding, okay, is part of the more general activity of strategy, as are lots of other arts, okay, strategy and military, in a kind of military strategy, okay. And so, again, this is supposed to be an example of how, even though each of our activities are inquiries and so on are for the sake of something else, sometimes the things that they're for the sake of are in turn for the sake of something else. And this basic idea is represented here in this diagram with Aristotle's example of bridle making and horsemanship and military science. Okay, and so what this means is that the activities that are more things that other things are done for the sake of, activities that are further along that line from A to B to C and so on, those activities are more final than the other activities, okay? And this leads Aristotle to the final point that I want to make in these lectures. He says, well then, this is a little argument that he makes for a conclusion. He says, if there's some end of the things we do, which we desire for its own sake, everything else being desired for the sake of this, okay? And if we don't choose everything for the sake of something else, for at that rate the process would go on to infinity, then there must be some good and there must be a chief good, okay? So what is he saying here? He's basically saying that if everything we do for some purpose, okay, and some of the things we do for a purpose are that purpose that we're doing them for is in turn done or sought after for the sake of something else, then this raises the question of whether there is some one thing that all of our activities are done in the service of. Or if there isn't, that would mean that everything we do is for the sake of something else, which in turn is for the sake of something else, and so on, for infinity. And that would be absurd. That would be crazy. That can't be the case. It can't be that everything we do for the sake of something else, which in turn is for the sake of something else, and that it just goes on forever. There must be some one thing. This is really what he's arguing for. There must be some one thing that everything we do is for the sake of. And then that raises the question, what is that one thing? So again, Aristotle calls this the chief good. He says if there is some one thing that everything is done for the sake of, then that must be the most good thing. That must be the ultimate end, the final end of everything else, the most final of all ends, okay? It must be the thing that everything else is for. And what is that thing? Is there anything that everything else that we do is done for the sake of? That's the first main question that he's gotten to by this point in his analysis in the Nicomachean Ethics. And the question of what that is, what the chief good is something he goes on to answer in the rest of the reading that I've assigned for you this week. And one of your reading response questions is to say what that is. So with that, I will leave you, and good luck.